It was me, y'all. I was part of the problem. So, let's begin course correcting. Bonjour, folks. I'm Sass. I work with sound as a tool for identity, documentation, and storytelling. For over a decade, I've done sound for film and podcasts, and I create custom soundscapes for journaling, healing, and embodiment through my sonic wellness platform, Home Frequency. This series is about sound and listening, not as background, but as forces that shape who we are, how we remember, and which stories are amplified or silenced. From oral histories in music, to recorded archives, to the soundtracks and soundscapes of our everyday lives. Welcome to the Sound Continuum. Now, I realize that opening declaration was a bit dramatic, so let me provide some context. Last year, I started writing about sound through my Substack, a sound analysis. Coming from a film production background, I used film sound design as the launchpad to talk about sound in a wider context, applying it to wellness habits such as mindfulness. And when I did my 2025 review of the films, composers, and soundtracks that I referenced in my writing, I realized the composers mentioned were all white men, and all of the films were American. Now, don't get me wrong. The scores of Bernard Herrmann, John Williams, and Jerry Goldsmith have left an indelible mark on cinema history, and me. And as background, I did complete my film school education in the United States. My critique wasn't that these films and composers don't deserve recognition, but the exercise was a reminder for me of how my education and perspective has been shaped via a Western lens, and that I want to intentionally expand that aperture to shed light on a global range of artists, sources, and histories. So, through this series, I intend to do just that, by sharing my sonic learning adventures with you. So let's start at the beginning. Sound is one of the original forms of communication and documentation, predating ancient times. Before humans had access to writing, people transmitted stories, folklore, myths, poems, history, spiritual and religious knowledge, and cultural traditions through a mixture of voice, instruments, chants, gestures, song, and dance. Storyteller was a recognized profession across cultures, and it was an essential role within communities. Across Western Africa in places like present-day Mali and Senegal, the role was known as griot for men and griot for women, and it was a hereditary position. Many griots accompanied kings and emperors, and during important occasions like weddings, villages would gather around a central fire, and it was these individuals who passed on stories of the family's genealogy and life events. Oral tradition was the key method of documentation within Indigenous societies throughout the Americas as well. According to Indigenous foundations at the University of British Columbia, scholars René Houlan and Renate Eigenbrod describe oral traditions as, quote, the means by which knowledge is reproduced, preserved, and conveyed from generation to generation. Oral traditions form the foundations of Aboriginal societies, connecting speaker and listener in communal experience and uniting past and present in memory, end quote. Oral traditions functioned as shared participatory experiences, allowing individual community members to contribute to an evolving narrative and a shared sense of identity. Storytellers, in turn, became living archives of cultural history and tradition, with sound serving as the medium through which lived memory, language, culture, spirituality, and identity were embodied and passed on. In the 15th century, as Europeans began to establish colonies throughout the Americas, Africa, and Asia, they brought with them the belief that written records and documentation held more credibility than centuries' worth of oral history. It's a mindset that continues to this day as Western governments, legal systems, and academic institutions often prioritize the written word for museum catalogs, archives, and public exhibitions. With oral documentation, each retelling allows the story to adapt. The speaker may shift their delivery, incorporate vocal or musical elements, emphasize different lessons depending on the context and the audience. Oral storytelling is therefore a dynamic record, evolving alongside the people and cultures it reflects. Written records, by contrast, are static, yet they are frequently treated as more authoritative within academic and Western spheres. However, written histories rarely account for the biases and prejudices held by those who authored them, particularly towards the people and places they documented. From 1900 through the 1960s, colonial agents conducted interviews with indigenous populations across several regions, including present-day Angola under Portuguese rule, Tanzania and Cameroon under German colonial administration, and Nigeria, Sierra Leone, and Uganda under British control. Audio recordings from these sessions are now owned and curated by institutions such as the British Library Sound Archive, which houses one of the largest collections of recorded sound in the world, and the Berlin Phonogram Archive, which houses a collection of ethnomusicological recordings, which is music from around the world. The British Library Sound Archive is home to a collection of interviews with individuals who were part of the Windrush generation. The HMT Windrush was a ship that carried passengers from Caribbean nations including Barbados, Jamaica, and Trinidad to the UK in 1948 to help fill labor shortages and rebuild the country after World War II. While preparing for this video, I read an article by Zarna Hart, a curator, designer, and educator at the University of the Arts London. Hart, who is of Trinidadian heritage, visited the British Sound Archive to access Windrush interviews and recordings of calypso music. In the article, she examines how calypso and its performers played an integral role in the post-colonial discourse that emerged as Caribbean nations gained independence in the 1960s. In her piece, she states, quote, "Like messengers, Calypsonians perform commentaries on the socio-political climate with the accompaniment of live acoustic and brass bands, opening the dialogue between the storyteller and audience. This dialogue of memory, like the written word, contains multitudes, and it exists as individually as it does a collective. Calypso, therefore, as an oral tradition, recreates a time in motion, reactivates collective memories of these times, and therefore embodies a transitory archive of a happened history. The accumulation of the storytelling recalibrates with every new memory and historical event that passes, with each pillar an integral part of the whole. The speaker, maker, the message, design, the listener, consumer, and the archive. This is what makes this particular culture so tender, for it is an all-encompassing and experiential mode of history telling, which from its inception defies tradition and colonial systems. Hart's article also exposes the limits of access within major cultural institutions. While the British Library did host a public exhibition in 2018 titled Windrush, Songs in a Strange Land, there is no permanent exhibition dedicated to these recordings today. Much of this sonic history remains housed within the archive itself, with only a small selection made publicly available through platforms like the library's SoundCloud. Preservation, in this case, does not guarantee visibility. And when access is selective, so is amplification. Institutions like these reveal an ongoing imbalance in whose stories are amplified and whose remain unheard. As long as colonial institutions retain literal and figurative access to the oral and written histories of their former subjects, and the ability to decide whether that history remains hidden or exhibited for public consumption, engagement, and reconciliation, the chains of colonialism remain unbroken. The history of sound recording technologies began with the acoustic era, during the Industrial Revolution in the 1800s, with the invention of the phonograph by Thomas Edison in 1877. During this time, the earliest recording technologies involved large horns or cones, which forced air pressure from sound waves onto a diaphragm, moving a scriber or stylus back and forth onto a recording medium, such as a cylinder or disc. Recording discs would eventually become the primary recording medium well into the 20th century. 1925 began the electrical era, when Western Electric introduced a range of electrical microphones and recorders, which produced higher fidelity recordings, as these devices enabled a wider range of frequencies to be captured, amplified, and processed electronically. The introduction of electronic equipment facilitated the rise of the broadcast industry, like public radio, and the synchronization of sound with film, enabling Hollywood to transition from its silent film era to talking pictures known as Talkies. The magnetic era began in 1945 during World War II, when Allied forces were able to get a hold of magnetic tape technology that had previously been invented by the Germans in the 1930s. The quality of magnetic tape recordings was comparable to that of a live broadcast, and tape became the primary medium for recording and mastering by audio professionals working in music and cinema. Tape enabled recording engineers and sound editors to manipulate sounds with ease and to create multi-track recordings. It also led to the development of the consumer goods market for portable devices. The digital era began in 1975 when Sony introduced the PCM, Pulse Code Modulation Encoder, which took analog sound signals and turned them into binary data of ones and zeros. The new digital sound encoding technology ignited a dramatic shift away from previous analog technologies, and digital rapidly became the new standard for professional and consumer products. Within a span of 20 years, recording mediums morphed from physical formats like CDs and cassettes to digital formats like MP3 and WAV files, to exclusively digital with streaming platforms like Spotify. The digital era transformed sound technology by shrinking devices and making them portable, reshaping how the public engaged with sound by making personal listening widely accessible. Today, affordable recording tools and digital audio workstations allow anyone, from amateur to professional, to record, edit, mix, and share their voice, music, or podcasts through platforms like Spotify. Digital audio has democratized access to sonic documentation, reshaping who gets to contribute to our collective narrative. As sound technologies evolved, so did the authority of the storyteller and the social spaces of listening. In oral traditions, the figures such as griots and designated storytellers held cultural responsibility, engaging in dialogue with their communities through shared communal listening. These village circles had functioned not only as sites of storytelling, but as spaces for public reflection, debate, and making sense of the world together. With the rise of broadcast sound, listening moved into the private sphere. Radios entered the home at the same time that Western societies increasingly organized themselves around the suburban nuclear family, narrowing listening from a communal practice into a domestic one. Authority shifted from culturally embedded storytellers to state and media institutions, and audiences were repositioned less as participants in a shared cultural conversation and more as passive listeners and consumers of sound. A defining moment that illustrates this cultural and technological shift was Orson Welles' 1938 radio adaptation of The War of the Worlds, broadcast across CBS's nationwide network.
Ladies and gentlemen, here is the latest bulletin from the Intercontinental Radio News, Toronto, Canada. Professor Morse of Macmillan University reports observing a total of 3 explosions on the planet Mars between the hours of 7:45 p.m. and 9:20 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. This confirms earlier reports received from American observatories. Now, nearer home, comes a special bulletin from Trenton, New Jersey. It is reported that at 8:50 p.m., a huge flaming object, believed to be a meteorite, fell on a farm in the neighborhood of Grover's Mill, New Jersey, 22 miles from Trenton. The flash in the sky was visible within a radius of several hundred miles, and the noise of the impact was heard as far north as Elizabeth. We have dispatched a special mobile unit to the scene.
Presented as a series of breaking news bulletins, the hour-long dramatization was so convincing that many listeners who tuned in late believed they were hearing live reports of an actual Martian invasion, prompting frantic calls to police stations and newspapers on the night that it aired. What made this moment so powerful wasn't just how realistic the broadcast sounded, but how much authority radio held at the time. Listening was no longer a shared conversational experience. There was no village circle to pause the story, question it, or place it in context. Instead, the broadcast voice was centralized, trusted, and rarely challenged. Radio didn't just deliver sound. It shaped how people understood what was real, creating a shared psychological experience built through mediated listening rather than face-to-face community. If radio demonstrated how sound could reshape collective experience without images, cinema would soon prove that sound could also redefine who was seen, heard, and remembered on the screen. The arrival of synchronized sound in film marked another major shift in storytelling authority, one that fundamentally altered whose stories would be told and how. Going into The Jazz Singer, I was well aware of its cultural and historical significance as the first talkie. That is, the first feature film to utilize synchronized speech and image. The film tells the story of Jackie Rabinowitz, a young Jewish boy whose father is the cantor at their local synagogue. Cantor Rabinowitz expects Jackie to follow in his footsteps and carry on the family tradition. But Jackie wants something very different. He wants to be a jazz singer. When we first meet him, Jackie is performing a ragtime tune at a beer garden. A family friend sees him there and reports it back to his father, who punishes Jackie with a whipping. This moment becomes the breaking point. Jackie runs away from home, and his father makes no effort to go after him. Years later, Jackie has reinvented himself under the anglicized stage name Jack Robin, and he's now a working jazz singer, chasing his big break on Broadway. What surprised me was that much of The Jazz Singer still follows the conventions of silent film, using orchestral music for the soundtrack and title cards for dialogue. The moments where Jackie performs, though, these are the scenes where sound is synced to the image, including the now iconic moment when Jackie says to the audience,
Wait a minute, you ain't heard nothing yet. Wait a minute, I tell you ain't heard nothing.
Around the same time of my viewing, I had done research for one of the Noirvember essays that I wrote for my home frequency community, titled When Noir Met Jazz, the music that taught us how to listen to the shadows. While reading about the origins of the genre, I learned that jazz music was born in African American neighborhoods in New Orleans during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And because Black music and culture represented the other for mainstream white audiences, a key point in the article was that in noir films, jazz often functioned as an oral shorthand for characters who lived on the margins of society. These were the people who gathered in bars and speakeasies after hours, moving through shadowed spaces, singing, dancing, and engaging in activities that polite society would rather not see. With that history in mind, and being aware that Al Johnson, a white actor, was the star of The Jazz Singer, I then had to wonder, why was a white guy the protagonist of a film about a black genre? I went into the film already skeptical of the plotline, and for the first hour or so, it is possible to read Jackie's estrangement from his father differently. You could argue that he's being disowned not because he's a jazz singer, but because he's turning away from his own Jewish cultural and religious heritage. His father's anger seems rooted in tradition, not race. However, after Jackie begins to find some success in his career, he returns home to try to convince his father to change his mind and embrace modern music. Instead, Cantor Rabinowitz banishes him from the home, declaring, "I never want to see you again, you jazz singer!" And I know he said that with the ER. The culmination scene where Jackie finally is about to make his Broadway debut is where my skepticism was validated. As Jackie sat at the vanity in his dressing room, getting ready for his performance, I watched as he began to rub black ink on his hands, and I thought,
Wait a minute.
Please don't tell me he's going to. Yeah, it all finally made sense. Even knowing that blackface was common at the time, I still was not prepared to see it on screen. There's a bitter irony here. The first talking picture tells the story of a man from one marginalized community finding success by borrowing the music and eventually the appearance of an even more marginalized one. What's striking is the paradox Erasure at work. The film assumes its audience already knows that jazz is black music. That understanding is made explicit through Jackie's performances in blackface. And yet, throughout the entire film, not a single black person appears on screen, not even in the background. The music is allowed to signal otherness, rebellion, and modernity, while the people who created it are nowhere to be seen. In that way, jazz ends up eclipsing even Jackie's Jewish identity as the primary marker of difference. It's a reminder of how powerful sound is as an identity marker. It shapes who is seen as belonging in public space and who is not. And The Jazz Singer ultimately reveals something deeper about sound technology itself. Technological progress does not guarantee representational progress. Even as recording and broadcast expanded, whose voices could be heard? There was never a guarantee that marginalized communities would be amplified through their own voices. And that tension is still with us today. We've traced how sound and listening moved through history, from communal storytelling as living memory, through the tensions between oral and written archives, through technological revolutions that reshaped society, and into the present moment where audio has been democratized, but amplification of marginalized voices and stories remains unbalanced. This was an overview of the kinds of conversations we'll be exploring in the Sound Continuum. Over the course of this series, I'll continue to break these ideas down in more depth as we move through global sonic traditions, evolving technologies, and the ways sound connects culture, wellness, and storytelling. If you'd like to go deeper with your own research, you'll find links in the description to all of the source materials referenced in the episode. And if you're interested in working with sound more intentionally, you can find links in the description to learn more about sonic identity architecture and home frequency, my platform for sound-based reflection, healing, and embodiment. Thank you for listening. If this resonated, you can support the work by sharing this episode, liking the video, and subscribing to the channel. Remember to stay tuned, stay present, and listen for what's amplified. TTYL.